In the last episode, we learned how we can make simple config files like this with key and value pairs, and now we're going to look at how we can use more complex features of config files to create headers like this, for example, that users cannot remove, how we can change the name of this config file. So instead of config.yml, it says settings.yml, for example, or messages.yml. And we're going to look at how we can save complex objects to our config file. And the first step is, just as before, to create the file that you want. For example, this time I want to call it settings.yml. And the first thing that we have to do differently now is we cannot use the getConfig method. We need to create the config variable ourselves. So for that, we're going to create two variables. The first one will be the config file. So private file is equal to new file, get data folder, then the name of our file. So in this case, settings.yml. And now we're going to create a reference to our configuration object. So private file configuration config, and this is equal to YAML configuration dot load configuration, and here we pass the file. And if we look at our getConfig method again, you can see that this returns file configuration object, which is the same as here. And this means that every method you can call on this getConfig method, you can also call on our custom config object. So for example, if you want to save a simple string to this config, we would call config.set, then the path, for example, greeting, message, and then the value. And this would save this key value pair to the configuration file, to the settings.yml. And now we need to write those changes to the actual file on the disk. Before we did that with save config, but now we have to write our own method to save the configuration file. So let's do that. Private void save settings, and this will just be config.save file, and surround that with a try catch block. And now after we've made the changes to the config file, we need to call our save settings file. And the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can create this header from the configuration file programmatically, and we do that to make sure that users cannot delete this header. Because if we do it with code, then the header will be regenerated on every server start. So also inside the onEnable method, for example, you could also do this in the onLoad method. Type config.options.set header, and inside here you have to provide a list of lines for the header. So in this example, our header consists of 3 lines, 1, 2, 3. Let's copy the first line, paste it here. Then the second line will be this, and the third line will be this again. And this is how easy it is to create a custom header for your config file. And the next thing is we're going to look at how you can save complex objects into your configuration file. So let's say you have an object teleport request which has 2 fields, private player1 and private player2. Then if you persistently want to save this object right here, you could either do it inside a database, or how we do it today, inside a .yml file. And if you want to save it into a YML file, you need to implement configuration serializable, then implement the method. This serialize method here will be called if you want to save this object to the configuration file, and you need to make sure that you return a representation of this class, how it should appear inside the config file. So for example, this contains only 2 fields, player1 and player2. So we need to return a map that holds key value pairs for each of those fields. So in this case, we want to return player1 first, and we call it player1, and the value of that is whatever is inside the player1 variable. And now we just repeat that for player2. So the key is called player2, and the value is whatever is inside player2. And of course, if you have more complex objects, this will get a bit more complex as well. And just one last thing for that to work, we need to register this object as configuration serializable inside our main plugin class. So inside here, call configuration serialization.register class, and then just input your teleport request.class right here. And then let's say in a hypothetical scenario where you're making a teleportation plugin, you need to save a teleport request to a config file. You will have a teleportation request object, of course, like this, for example. And now you can save it to the config as easily as config.set request and save. And now to get that teleportation request from the config, you can just do final teleportation request from config, and this is equal to config.get get, and then you just input the path and cast it to the object that you need. So in this case, teleport request. And now if you start the server, you can see that the plugin automatically generated our config files. First the old config file, which looks like this, and then the new config file, which looks the same, but the difference is now if you remove the header here and remove the header here and then restart the server, you can see that the header is not added back here, but it was automatically added back into our new custom config file.